a little light this morning. Cody, would you mind leading us in a word of prayer? Form health and be able to return to us. We're in the book of Galatians. I want to thank Carl for stepping in for me last week. I made a joke on Wednesday or Thursday that I was going to call in sick on Sunday so I didn't have to follow Brother Kemp. And Saturday, I guess that came to fruition. So, um, yeah, it kind of backfired on me. So, um, glad to be back. We uh, we went through about the first 7 verses last time in the first class, and so just kind of recount some of that. One of the main things that is pointed out through the first several verses of Galatians, and it's going to carry on throughout, is the heavy emphasis on the gospel, and everything that is being taught and being preached is not from man. So that's a big emphasis, and we're going to see that as we go out down through some of these next verses. Um, we had kind of wrapped up in verse 7 talking about um, those teaching another gospel, which there is not another gospel. And we talked about the different things today that um, might be considered a different gospel, what we might call a different gospel. We talked about who those are in today's world who might be called those who trouble you and try to pervert the gospel. And we discussed how there's some of those that we might find inside the church and outside of the church, and so that's kind of where we finished. I'd like to jump into verse 8, 8 and 9. We're going to kind of take those together, and then what I'd like to do is spend some time on verses 8 through 12, and then I think we will find that as we get into verses about 13 through 16, there's a lot of meat in those, and so I think we'll be spending quite a bit of time there. But if you have comments, please feel free to interject at any time. So we'll start there in verse 8, and we'll read verses 8 and 9 of Galatians chapter 1. But even if we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel to you than what we have preached to you, let him be accursed. As we have said before, so now I say again, if anyone preaches any other gospel to you than what you have received, let him be accursed. So as we look at verses 8 and 9, what I drew out of that as I read that is he basically repeats himself from verse 8 to verse 9. So any thoughts on that? Any thoughts on why he might have felt it was important to repeat himself there?
Whether it's false or not, because some people just go with the flow, whatever, that they don't know what the scriptures say, so they believe everything anyone teaches.
Jim, there have always been those who believe very opposite of what this is saying. Like the angel of Moroni coming to Joseph Smith, the angel Gabriel coming to Muhammad. And so the Holy Spirit anticipated these days. And so he's trying to get through the heads of, especially their followers. These people are false.
Yeah. Well, all through Paul's ministry, the Judaizing teachers followed.
There's where he went. And so they were trying to discard him from being as an apostle because he wasn't here when Jesus was. He didn't follow Jesus around as the others had done. So they were, anything they could come up with against him, prove or false, they brought it up. And so then, apparently this, to me, this is what is taking place. And I think the emphasis really is here, repeats it twice. So it's absolutely, essential that they understand this. And we have to be careful today in looking at these two verses, like he says, of falling away, like he brought out something creeping in or listening to somebody we don't need to listen to. And that is the reason our salvation is based upon this book. And it's just, I guess these texts start, we need to know what it says.
You know, if the entire Bible obviously is important, and it's but I feel like he repeats himself here, because if we don't believe this, if we don't believe this doesn't get through our head, then the rest of it's really irrelevant, because it doesn't matter if we're following some other gospel. And so it says, I've said this before, I'm saying it now, I'm saying it again. There's no other gospel. There's nothing else out there. This is the gospel, and it's not the man. And so I think it's really important to think about that as we see those verses.
Well, I think there's an emphasis for me when I read them. I think we, that could be apostles, if we, as an apostle, or an angel, then when you drop down to verse 9, anyone. So in those two verses, if any being, anyone, any person, any apostle, anyone comes to you with a different gospel, then you don't listen to it. And so to me, when I read those, and then he does repeat himself, and if he just said it once, that would have been significant. But if he says it twice, then that just continues to stress the significance of there's one gospel message, you don't listen to anyone that will tell you anything different. Because if you do, then you're going to run the risk or promise of being cursed. So I'm sitting here in my mind from a preaching standpoint, I'm thinking how you could just use the word A, the letter A, and go through here. You know, if you adhere to the teaching of an apostle or an angel or anyone, and it's wrong, then you're going to stand the risk and the promise of being cursed. And that is a strong word, a curse.
Mm-hmm.
If there is anything other than one gospel, then we can believe whatever we want to. We can just throw the book away and like a lot of people have, and do what we want to do. And that's exactly the reason you see the many churches that ends up down the road. And I said this before, when I was a kid, it was about 3 or 4 in Wilcox, how they tried to quit. And it's because that's what the man wants to do, not what God.
You know, the other thing I thought about as I was thinking about this is, you know, as these letters were being written during this time, you know, they had the old law, and when this all came into effect, you know, Paul and others may have been preaching to some of these people for the first time, you know, this new law. And so as you think about that, you think about how, you know, I think we lose sight of that, because in today's world, for the most part, you know, someone that we talk to, they have an idea about God, they have an idea about Jesus, they have an idea about the church, and some of the things that, you know, we believe and we hold to. There was a lot of differences here. So as they're teaching this, obviously there was resistance, but I think it's important that he brings out this is it. This is the final. So if somebody comes to you 200 years from now and says, oh, well, now I've got this other gospel, well, it's not, there's nothing to that. And so I think that's important to.
And the typical response today is, well, that's the way it was back then. Implying that we have a right to change things today.
And I think what we see here too is like I said, the Judas and preachers following Paul and traveling. But we got to understand that Christ built his church. And everything just didn't end right there with everybody and something new to take over. And in essence, it did. But it took years and years. Some people that a lot of them, I suppose, just had to die before we did away with what they had learned for years and years and years and years. You know, the Jewish system had been in effect for a long, long time. And it takes some time to start getting something new.
I've always kind of cringe when I hear people say, well, we just always done it that way. When you talk about business or the community or different things that are going on, well, we're just doing it that way because we've always done it that way. Well, I've always kind of been against that, and when you come to church, I mean, that's the way it is.
We've done it that way since the first century, and that's the way that the Bible tells us to do it. And so, anyway, just some thoughts there.
I mean, for centuries, people were looking for the Messiah. There's people still looking for the Messiah today. I don't think they're looking really hard for their plan. It's like we talked about, there's a different building on every corner. Everybody's always looking for something. I mean, where's it at? It says engineers and, it teaches, people that it's kind of like the statement you make. Just because we done it that way is not good enough. Prove it to me again. And that's what you say when you say that. I mean, what you just said. You want it reproved to you every time. And luckily for you, you're in the church and you accept that fact. But there's a lot of people out there that are still looking for that. Prove it to me again, prove it to me again. But I don't think their heart's really in it. They want it really to be what they want it to be. And I think what Paul told us, like you said, this is it. It's fine. There will not be anything else brought to you. It's not going to be a new revelation. Except what we're telling you, because that is what it's going to be. But you need to understand that there's going to be people trying to teach you something that they think is the better gospel.
And the second thing is, we take the day of judgment for them to really understand. They won't understand this life. They got their minds closed.
Right.
So as we think about some of that, that goes right into verse 10. It says, "For do I now persuade men or God, or do I seek to please men? For if I still please men, I would not be a bondservant of Christ." So again, we see that it's brought out here. And I don't know the count in the first 10 verses, but there's just this reiterating that we're not here to please men and that the gospel is not from man. The ESV, instead of persuade, it says, do I seek the approval of man? And so that's another kind of way to look at it here. Let's go to 1 Thessalonians 2, verse 4. It says, "But as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, even so we speak, not as pleasing men, but God who tests our hearts." So, again, we're not seeking the approval of man. We're not here to be pleasing to men, but to God. Again, approved by God. it says here in Thessalonians, approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel. And it says, not as pleasing men, but God who tests our hearts. And so that just brings out the fact even more as we think about that. I want to touch a little bit on the word bondservant as it brings that out in verse 10. As we know Paul's history, do I seek to please men, or if I still please men? Well, we know that, and as we're going to get into verse 13 and 14 over here, we know about his history and the fact that he realizes now that he was seeking to please men. But it says, I would not be a bondservant of Christ. And I think we've done some studies on the word bondservant before. We'll just bring that out. It literally means slave. And the definition that I like from the Blue Letter Bible, it brought out given to one another so as to disregard one's own interests. And so, as we think about our attitude towards God and towards the church and towards the gospel, are we given to that so as to disregard our own interests? And so that's just kind of some self-reflection that we have to do. As we think about, I think Brother Hiram brought out some good points. Is kind of what's important to you, but I think that's important to think about as we think about being a bondservant.
If I might make another comment, there are two Greek words for slave. This word here is describing a slave who places himself willingly under another. Like Paul and others. The other word slave is one who is, bought and forced to serve. And so Paul is saying, I am a willing slave for Christ.
Yep, and so I think it's important to think about our attitude with regard to that too, and disregarding ourselves for the cause of Christ. So that's basically the way that I look at it.
And we need to be thankful for these scriptures that we're studying today. We need to be thankful that they're here this morning. Because and when we look at all the apostles and what they taught, they taught the same thing. And as the churches today must do, be with God. But to be thankful that somebody, in the case of Paul and of the other apostles, no matter what come about, whether it was very death or whatever, stood for the truth and preached the gospel. There was nothing that interfered with that. So when we get into Paul's life, you will remember all the things that happened to him. But the gospel was so important to these people that even though they feared death, it doesn't make any difference.
As we continue verses 11 and 12, it just continues to bear out the fact that the gospel is not according to man. So let's read down in verses 11 and 12. But I make known to you, brethren, that the gospel which was preached to me is not according to man. For I neither received it from man, nor was I taught it, but it came through the revelation of Jesus Christ. So, a couple of references here that I want to go to that I think will kind of help with some of this. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 1 and 2. Says, moreover, brethren, I declare to you the gospel which I preach to you, which also you received, and in which you stand, by which you are also saved, if you hold fast that word which I preach to you, unless you believe in vain. So talking about the gospel there. And then Ephesians chapter 3, verses 3 through 5. It says, how that by revelation he made known to me the mystery, as I have briefly written already, by which, when you read, you may understand my knowledge and the mystery of Christ, which in other ages was not made known to the sons of men, and it has now been revealed by the Spirit to his holy apostles and his prophets. And so I think this is something that may be a subject that we avoid a lot of times as far as the revelation through the Spirit to the apostles, because we don't understand it. We don't understand it the way that, because it doesn't relate in a worldly sense to our, I guess, our key brains is how does that happen? So how did Paul, he says, I neither received it from a man nor was I taught it, but it came through the revelation of Jesus Christ. Well, imagine, you're reading this letter, or you're sitting out there, and Paul's preaching to you, and he says, nobody taught me this. It came to me through God, or from God through the Holy Spirit. So I guess I just think about how I would react to that, and how I would, take that and think about that as I was, I'm used to going out and doing all these sacrifices and stuff, and then he's telling me, all this other. I mean, just think about how overwhelming that would be to have received that at that time. And he's saying, nobody taught me this. I mean, how would we react to that? We might call him crazy.
Well, in the true Jewish faith, what they were doing is preparing for that moment, for that Messiah coming, for that gospel to be preached by Paul. So they were,
If they understood
they understood
the prophecy and
the prophecy
yeah.
of what, and they should have. I mean, the rabbis, most of them did, but they didn't want to give that power, just like everything today. They'll give power, but they should have known he was coming, and they should have known that it would be in. So, I mean, you're right, it would be, when you met your wife, you were a member of the church. There were a lot of shattered glass around you when she finally told you what you needed to know, I'm sure.
Yeah. I think we're all reluctant to change. We're all reluctant and resistant to admit that maybe we were wrong. And so, I don't know, it's interesting.
But most all of us think we're okay anyway. Whether we're religious or not, we think we're fine in the position or situation in which we find ourselves. And like you just said, teaching somebody a different religion or religious view or religious point is not easy for them to accept. And neither was it for Paul's audience. But when he began telling a story that no man could have possibly made up, and it made sense, that's what caused a lot of conversions.
Yeah, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but it's the gospel that saves, it's the gospel that converts. It's not the man. But I think it's just this group of people must have really struggled with something that pertained to thinking that Paul's teachings and everything is coming from man. Because it's just bam, 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 all the way through the first part of this chapter. So,
I think they always had trouble comprehending that Paul was inspired because of his past. I think that always haunted him a little bit and stuff. And, they, in the background, they might know that Peter was inspired. It was just Paul. Paul was he orchestrations, things like that, took after. So I think, in most of his letters, we all know this, that he's always defending his apostleship because of that past and stuff. He's pointing this out. And that's why I think they always had trouble comprehending that it was inspired because of that. You're gonna get to it later in the letter and stuff, but.
Yeah, murderer one day, and lost the preacher the next rock.
So I think that has a lot to do with it, and he's always had like, this is not my man, this is I'm inspired, and it was always a, hey, right off the bat, it's a,
Yeah, that's a good point. So,
I think if they didn't know his history.
Yeah.
It would have been a lot easier. It's kind of like Ken said, murder one day, God appreciate it.
I always explained it like, in the classroom, like, if Hitler just turned 180 and they're like, whoa, yeah, that would be, yeah, because everybody knows what the past of Hitler did. So it took a kid learning that in school, they're like, well, that's a big thought, man. That's like, that's exactly the way the Christians looked at it, is Paul was a murderer, he was, so, flip-flop, oh, really? No, I don't know about that. Even the first guy that came up to him trying to get to that time, what was it? He was scared to death that he was approaching. So it haunted him. I think it haunted him everywhere, even in his letters, people trying to accept it.
yeah, and that speaks a couple of things to me that, we oftentimes place our trust in man and worldly things because we trust that because of his history that he's not going to be. It's just like today. I mean, if somebody, was like, Hitler's a perfect example. Our trust is in man, and oftentimes maybe we should have a little faith in God that, hey, this is real. And then the other side of that is how encouraging is it, and we bring this out a lot, but how encouraging is it to us to know that even someone who was as bad as Paul or Saul was able to turn around and then be one of the most decorated people for the cause of Christ, so it's that's going to be encouraging side of it.
And I think another aspect too is who was going to convert Paul if it wasn't for Jesus and the gospel. The Jews had no interest in that. The Gentiles thought it was foolishness. I mean, the Jews, they were applauding Paul. They thought he was doing just exactly what he ought to, and even he did. When you look at Acts 23, verse 1, he thought he should do everything opposing Christ. So, who would have converted Saul of Tarsus or the Apostle Paul if it wasn't for Jesus and the power of the gospel? And it's the same thing that if we applied it to Hitler or anyone, what the Germans weren't interested in changing Hitler's mind. And if it hadn't been for others in the world, he would have never been stopped. And so, Hitler's a pretty good example. What has the power to change possibly Hitler's life? The only thing is the gospel.
Well, Carl, in that same thing, which one of the original apostles would have been the apostle to approach Saul and try to convert him back to him?
No, well, that wasn't Peter, because Paul is going, later on, he's going to face Peter to his face. So, and Peter was supposed to be in that day and time the leader, more or less, he was the main one. So even Peter had his, I was going to go to the Gentiles, and this is God's plan. Peter was a Jew, Paul was a Jew, but then so Peter was left to do what he was supposed to do, go to the Jews and talk to the Gentiles. So then when that, for these things to take place, it had to take time. It had to take time to change over the people's mind and see the difference. It's like we see, as long as Peter was eating, with the Jews and with the Gentiles and all, till those from Jerusalem came. And so it takes time, and I think, of course, Jesus came at the right time. You can't argue with that. Can't argue with that. But They had so discarded the law and were teaching for doctrine and commandments of men, till they were looking for a king. And then that's not what they were supposed to be looking for.
Just shows the power of the gospel. But, this is kind of really where I wanted to get, start diving into, what everybody's kind of bringing out, bits and pieces about Paul's history is, so as we look into verses 13 and 14, for you have heard of my former conduct in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God beyond measure, and I tried to destroy it. And I advanced in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries in my own nation, being more exceedingly zealous for the traditions of my fathers. So, I want to go to a couple of places in Acts, and we could spend a lot of time. We could dive into this as deep as we wanted to, but just a couple of verses. Acts chapter 8, in verse 3, says, as for Saul, he made havoc of the church, entering every house and dragging off men and women to be in prison. And then over in chapter 9, verse 1, then Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked letters from him to the synagogues of Damascus, so that if he found any who were of the way, whether men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. And then turn over to chapter 26 verse 9 says, indeed, I myself thought I must do many things contrary to the name of Jesus of Nazareth. So we could go to scripture after scripture after scripture and hit on all the things that Paul did, but those are just a few that kind of highlight that last one to me brings out, he thought that he was supposed to do many things contrary to Jesus. And so, as we think about, if we think about Paul, or Saul at the time, and in his former conduct, was he genuine? Was he genuinely thinking he was doing the right thing? And so, to the degree that he was genuinely doing the right thing, or thought he was doing the right thing, how many people do we see in the world today that are genuinely thinking they're doing the right thing? They're whatever it is they're doing, whatever church building it is they're going to, whatever acts of ministry they're involved in, they genuinely think they're doing the right thing. And to me, that's the most dangerous place to be. Because if you think you're right, then what's the need to change? And so, if you're trucking along and you think you're good and you think you're right, and you're going to heaven, then there's no need for Satan to try to get you, because he's got you right where he wants you. If you know you're going down the wrong path, then it's a little bit easier to change than if you think you're right.
I think that's the same reason that maybe addicts, we have a problem, and I don't know this, but it's easier for them to see because they don't have anything else left. When you get to the bottom, then if somebody's preaching Jesus to you, that sounds pretty good.
You can only look up.
Yeah, that sounds pretty good. But you take the person, like you said, and standing over there, thinks he's just fine. I don't do this to you, though.
Yeah.
You know, we think we're just fine. Well, so do most who go to other churches. But the thing is, we're willing to show the scriptures that back up what we do, practice and believe. Others refuse. They close their mind to accepting the fact that they are right. Case closed. There's a difference, attitude.
You know, and there's many practices we can talk about. If I've practiced something for years and years and years and years, I've never had any problems. You know, let's say I'm building something and I've built it this way for years and years and years and years, and I've never had any issues with it. Somebody comes along one day and says, "You're building that wrong." No, I'm not. I've been building it this way for 30 years and I've never had any problems with it. Well, they're going to be resistant to that change because there's nothing wrong in their mind, you know. But then judgment day is going to come, you know, and that building's going to fall down, and it's too late, you know, at that point. And so it's just that, to me, that's where such the danger comes in is with these people that are so genuine. And we know, I mean, they're all among us. They're our friends, they're our family members that are so genuine, thinking they're doing the right thing. And those are the hard conversations to have. Jeff?
Part of the problem that I think, and part of the difference between Judaism and Christianity is today we have false Christianity and Christianity. They have the same word, the same truth that we have, the same scriptures, the same verses that you just quoted. Even if another brings you another gospel, they have that verse, they use that against us when we try to teach them. So it's a little different in that regard than it was changing over from Judaism to Christianity.
Well, I think we have with the, you know, it's a whole lot easier to listen to somebody.
So to me, what that brings out is Jeremiah 9:14 says, "But they have walked according to the dictates of their own hearts and after the Baals, which their fathers taught them." So how important is proper teaching? So, just like Dale said, if I've been taught wrong, I'm gonna believe that. There's no reason for me not to, if I'm genuinely thinking I'm right. And so that proper teaching is, I mean, that just brings out how important and how imperative that is, you know, back here in the back for us. But also, we've got to find a way to teach outside the church so that people don't get so ingrained in and indoctrinated in, you know, other things. Because, you know, is it going to be easier to teach somebody who's younger or who's, you know, I mean, obviously we know the answer to that. Just some thoughts.
You know, we have some friends that don't even go to service at all, and they think they're okay. They think they're just fine. And that is the sad part. But it's easier to teach someone that has not been filled up with Bible teaching. And like myself, when Rome and I were going together, then we would drag in church. And the first time I heard a preacher say anything about the church being the only one, well, I left there just, you know, it's sure, I just couldn't believe this. I couldn't understand that. So in a long sense, and to make this story a little shorter, I spent a good many years after I became a Christian not trying to prove, but everything that was said that I heard, I had to find it. I had to find it because I wanted to be sure that I was right. And I don't say that everybody had to do that, but then that was, I had never heard that before. But then I I wasn't raised up in a denomination. You know. But, of course, my mother and dad believed there was God and Christ and all that, but still, they didn't see fit to carry me to church. But then I think all of us have a responsibility to see that the truth is taught. And when we let that down, when I let it down, when you let it down, or Wayne or anybody else, then that's when we get in trouble for something to come in free in. And one of us might think, well, that's okay. And then it just grows and grows and grows.
Yeah, it was just the stubborn, the stubborn folks like yourself and myself that did that. Spent, several years trying to,
Actually, is he still stubborn?
not stubborn as her. Or her daughter. I think her daughter got this all beat.
Lance, I stood on the side of the road talking to some friends, kind of like what Dale was talking about. And was it yesterday, day before yesterday? And I was doing something and they drove by and I stopped and got off the tractor. Went over and I was talking to them about some things that were going on. And she explained to me that, and they don't attend church anymore. I mean, and I know, she said, I used to go to community, something about the church party, and I knew the associate pastor or whatever she called him, and he was fooling around with the women in the congregation, and I said, well, that's what you call hypocrite. And then she started going on, and she said, I know that I'm saved, and I can say, and we were talking about words that people say. I can say those words, and I know that I'm okay. And I thought, I'm gonna get past this, and then at some point, she got to where she was on the verge of like being so mad, and I thought, I better stop, or never go anywhere else, and I just quit. But she is as convinced that she's right as she's maybe more convinced that she's right than I'm convinced that I'm right. And that's a scary thing too. She was mad scared. I mean, she was so right, she was mad. And that's the scary part when you talk to people. They are, and I don't know if they know they're wrong and they just put themselves in that situation, or they think they're so right that they can't be wrong.
They don't know they're wrong. They think they're right. I mean, that's the scary part of it, is that doctrine lends itself to that this all
There's nothing I can do.
this all loving God, which God is all loving, but He's also a lot of other things, and that doctrine lends itself to, I know I'm right because God's going to take care of me, and it's just it's so hard to get out of that.
Well, people can understand that they can punish their kids and say that they love them. But they can't understand that God can say, I love you, and then punish you. That's just not in their vocabulary.
Well, I have friends that I do, like, there's a friend that came to the shop and we were talking about that church, and she says, well, how do you know what is the right church? So I gave her my cylinder shovel, and I said, we'll discuss it whenever you finish. She didn't want to discuss it, she doesn't go to church. She read the whole book, loved the book, but didn't do anything about it. But the seeds came. So, I never see her do anything different.
It just brings out how important our teaching of our young, so they don't fall away and fall into that, but it also brings out, what do we do? We've got to find ways to evangelize, as we just had our relationship about that. We've got to find ways to evangelize. And like Dale said, sometimes it's just going to take time, but to reach those people that are in those states. Any other comments, and we'll get into verse 15 next time.
Let me bring up one more thing. far as we talk about family, guys, and this, I mean, I know we're talking about your hand, but don't ever give up on plans, because I have one particular, I said, well, you should have Bible with me. Well, yeah, I guess I will. So, that brought fell along there, and I knew his wife told him everything. So, I thought, well, it's going, I said, we'll make it all right for you, wife, and we'll do it. You know, we'll start sometime. And so I never did get a call, finally, she called. And she would remember the church, went to church. She said, he doesn't want to say, he says he'll go to church with me. Well, several months and years. He didn't want to say.
But he might not have gone to church with her if he hadn't had that.
So we don't ever know, we don't know. God didn't put us here to make all of us sick, just to do something.
Thank you all.